What if the biggest lie in history wasn't the snake, but what we've been taught about it? What if the forbidden fruit had never been a punishment, but a gift? In the Garden of Eden, Eve heard a promise that resonates to this day. You will be like gods. And the most disturbing thing is that it came true. From that moment on, humanity gained something irreversible: consciousness, choice, creation. But why was this knowledge called sin? What really happened in Eden wasn't a fall. It was an awakening, and someone tried to erase it from our memory. What if the Garden of Eden was never just a lost paradise, but a laboratory of consciousness? Have you ever stopped to think that perhaps the story you learned about Adam, Eve, and the forbidden fruit has been oversimplified, or even distorted? What you're about to discover may completely change the way you see creation, freedom, and even yourself. When we talk about Eden, we almost always imagine a perfect, harmonious place, where nothing was lacking and nothing needed to be questioned. But does perfection mean freedom? Or was the garden, in fact, a space of absolute order, where everything was already defined before any choice was even made? Stay with me, because this distinction is essential to understanding the true meaning of the promise made by the serpent. According to many spiritual and Gnostic readings, Adam and Eve did not live in a state of complete enlightenment, but in a condition of guided innocence. They existed, breathed, cared for the garden, but did not choose in the deepest sense of the word. Their actions were aligned with a higher structure, almost like children protected by invisible rules. There was harmony, yes, but there were also limits. And silent limits are often the most powerful. From this perspective, the Garden of Eden was not a space of creative freedom, but of controlled equilibrium. A field where human consciousness had not yet awakened to the self. There was no guilt, but there was also no authorship. There was no pain, but neither was there true self-knowledge. Have you ever experienced something similar? That feeling of security that, at the same time, seems like a gilded cage? This is where many occult and philosophical traditions begin to raise uncomfortable questions. If God created humankind in his image, why deny them knowledge? If the human soul carries a divine spark, why keep it dormant? These questions run through centuries of biblical mythology, deep spirituality, and Gnosticism, leading us to see Eden not as the pinnacle of human experience, but as its starting point. Within this context, the forbidden fruit ceases to be a simple object of disobedience and comes to symbolize something much deeper: the awakening of consciousness. Before it, there was no good or evil in the moral sense. There was only obedience and permanence. The garden functioned as a perfect, but static order. And every static order, however beautiful, prevents transformation. Perhaps that's why the idea of falling needs to be revisited. Because falling often is simply leaving a state of protection and entering a state of responsibility. And responsibility demands choice. Choice demands awareness. And awareness inevitably brings pain, but it also brings creation. Does that start to make sense to you? Throughout history, Eden has been described as the place from which we were expelled. But what if it was the place we needed to leave? Not as punishment, but out of necessity. Like a child who needs to leave their parents' home to discover who they truly are. This reading doesn't deny the sacredness of the garden, it deepens it. It transforms Eden into a symbol of the beginning of the soul's journey, not its failure. As we move forward, it's worth asking, who truly benefited from a human being without choice? And who would fear a conscious, creative humanity, capable of discerning for itself? What lies behind this story goes far beyond a simple religious narrative. Take a deep breath, because now that the stage is set, we're ready to take a close look at the most misunderstood figure in this story, and the promise that changed everything. And before we delve even deeper into this story, let me invite you to be an active part of this journey. Because everything we're exploring here isn't just ancient theory or distant myth. It's something that touches the human experience in a very intimate way. If at any point in this video you felt a shiver, a doubt arose, or even a discomfort that's hard to explain, that already says a lot. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below about what has touched you the most so far. Your reading, your experiences, and even your questions help enrich this space for reflection. Perhaps you see Eden as a symbol of loss. Perhaps as a starting point. Perhaps as a mirror of your own inner journey. Sharing this here creates something powerful. a community of people who don't accept ready-made answers and allow themselves to question. And when you comment, you're not just talking to me, you're talking to other curious souls who are also watching now. If this content is resonating with you, consider liking the video. It seems simple, but this gesture signals that this type of reflection needs to continue to exist. This is what allows more people to find this channel and have access to stories and interpretations that rarely appear in mainstream settings. And if you feel you want to continue exploring the secrets of the Garden of Eden, the serpent Eve, Lilith, and everything that has been hidden throughout time, subscribe to the channel. Not as a number, but as someone who chooses to walk alongside us. Your presence here strengthens this space and keeps this exchange alive. Now that this connection has been established, we move forward because we haven't yet spoken of the promise itself and the knowledge that, according to the serpent, could liberate the soul. When the story of Eden is told in the traditional way, there is always one figure that automatically takes on the role of the enemy, the serpent. From an early age, we learn to see it as a symbol of the fall, of temptation, and of lies. But what if this interpretation were incomplete? What if it had been constructed from a specific perspective, interested in preserving a certain order? This is where the narrative begins to transform, because when we observe the serpent more closely, we realize that it never acts through force, fear, or imposition. It speaks. It questions. It sparks reflection. And that, in itself, changes everything. Within Gnostic traditions and various ancient symbolic currents, the serpent appears as a very different archetype from the villain we have been presented with. It appears as a messenger between worlds, as a guardian of hidden knowledge, and as a symbol of transformation. Think for a moment. The serpent sheds its skin, is reborn from itself, goes through cycles without carrying the past in its body. In many cultures, this was never seen as something negative, but as living wisdom, as consciousness in motion. The problem may never have been the serpent, but what it offered. When the text says that she approaches Eve, there is no threat, no coercion. There is a simple, almost innocent question that carries a profound impact on the mindset of the listener. Is that really what they told you? This question is not an attack. It is an opening. It is the kind of questioning that breaks down internal structures and begins a journey. Because every transformation begins like this, with doubt. And doubt, although feared by rigid systems, is the first step towards any expansion of consciousness. Now, observe how the narrative changes when we remove the moral filter imposed over the centuries. The serpent doesn't promise external power, dominion over others, or material advantages. It speaks of perception, of becoming conscious, of seeing beyond what has been allowed until now. You will be like gods, knowing good and evil. This phrase, so often repeated as proof of a great lie, can carry another meaning when analyzed more deeply. It's not about competing with the divine, but about accessing the divine spark that already existed dormant within the human being. Here enters an uncomfortable truth. A being that does not choose is not free. Before the fruit, Adam and Eve lived in a state of perfect obedience, but also of unconsciousness. There was no real decision, no internal conflict, no responsibility. Everything was already determined. The serpent emerges precisely at this point as a catalyst for a necessary rupture. Not as an enemy of creation, but as an agent of change. And every true change carries a price. Awakening is never comfortable. Now, without realizing it, we are getting behind the scenes of this story. Because if knowledge liberates, it also exposes. It forces human beings to confront their own shadows, their choices, and their consequences. Perhaps that's why knowledge has always been treated as something dangerous. Not because it destroys, but because it transforms. And transformation is frightening. It changes mindsets, dismantles hierarchies, breaks dependencies. A conscious humanity is not easily controlled. And here comes the central question that resonates to this day. What if the serpent hadn't lied? What if it had only revealed a truth that couldn't be openly spoken? A truth that needed to be found, not given. In many ancient traditions, knowledge was never imposed. It was offered as a possibility. Those who were ready moved forward. Those who weren't remained where they were. The serpent doesn't push Eve. It doesn't force her. It presents a choice. And that completely changes the interpretation of the episode. Do you see how this relates to our own journey? How many times throughout life have you encountered information, experiences, or truths that changed everything? At first, perhaps they caused fear, confusion, or even guilt. But later, looking back, you realize that that moment marked a before and after. The serpent represents exactly that, the breaking point between comfortable innocence and responsible awareness. As this interpretation deepens, it becomes clear that the true sin was not eating the fruit, but leaving the state of protected ignorance. And this has a profound impact on how we understand guilt, fall, and redemption. Perhaps there was never a fall in the moral sense, but rather a descent necessary to the human experience. An immersion in the world of choices, of opposites, of the construction of the self. The serpent does not bring down the human being. It pushes him into himself. While many later texts attempted to transform this figure into a symbol of absolute evil, the oldest echoes tell a different story. A story about courage, about risk, about crossing the threshold of the known. And when we look at the world today, at identity crises, at modern spiritual quests, at the collective desire for meaning, it becomes difficult to ignore that this narrative is still alive. The serpent continues to whisper, not in mythical gardens, but within the mind of each person who begins to question what they have been taught. And perhaps the most uncomfortable thing of all is admitting that knowledge was never forbidden because it was false, but because it was too powerful. Powerful enough to change decisions, trajectories, and destinies. When the serpent speaks, it does not destroy Eden. It ends one cycle and begins another. A cycle where the soul ceases to be guided and begins to walk. It is precisely here that the story begins to gain even deeper layers, because by understanding the role of the serpent, we are led to look with different eyes at what has been called the promise. A promise that did not concern the body, but consciousness. And as this promise begins to be revealed, other pieces of this ancestral puzzle begin to move, pointing to something that goes far beyond a simple fruit. If everything we're exploring resonates with you in some way, comment below with a word or short phrase that represents what this perspective has awakened in you. Something like, "This has changed my way of seeing things," or "I'm questioning everything now." When the serpent utters the phrase, "You will be like gods," something far deeper is being activated than is usually perceived in a superficial reading. This statement does not point to thrones, supernatural powers, or dominion over other beings. It touches directly on consciousness. To be like gods, in this context, means awakening to the capacity to perceive, decide, and create one's own experience. It is a call to the autonomy of the soul. And perhaps that is precisely what has made this promise so uncomfortable throughout history. For a long time, the idea of divinity was associated with something external, distant, and inaccessible. A power above, separate, that observes and controls. But in Gnostic traditions and in various ancient philosophical currents, the divine is also internal. It dwells as potential, as a dormant spark, waiting to be recognized. When the serpent speaks of being like gods, it is not proposing a replacement for the divine, but a reminder. A silent revelation that human consciousness carries something of the same creative nature. This completely changes the mindset with which we look at this passage. Because from this point of view, the fruit does not grant physical strength, nor immortality in the body. It grants discernment, the ability to distinguish, evaluate, and choose. Before that, everything was simple, predictable, and ordered. Then comes the complexity of decision-making. The weight of responsibility arises, and with it, true freedom. Not a comfortable freedom, but a real freedom that demands maturity. Being like gods, therefore, is directly linked to the act of creating one's own journey. Creating thoughts, attitudes, paths. And all creation is born from a conscious choice. This is where many get lost, interpreting this promise as arrogance. In truth, it is an invitation to spiritual responsibility. Because when you awaken, you can no longer blame only external forces. Transformation begins within, and this has a direct impact on how you live, relate, and see the world. Notice how this idea resonates with very current themes? Mindset, decisions, emotional autonomy, sense of purpose. All of this is connected to the same symbolic root. The awakening of consciousness is not an isolated event in Eden. It repeats itself at different moments in human life. Whenever someone realizes that they are not just a spectator, but an active agent in their own story, this promise manifests itself again. And this never happens without internal conflict. Because awareness broadens vision, but it also broadens responsibility. By eating the fruit, Adam and Eve begin to perceive opposites: good and evil, light and shadow, desire and limitation. This perception does not create evil, it reveals it. And revealing is not always comfortable. Often it hurts. Often it disrupts. But it is also the only path to authentic freedom. The serpent's promise was not an easy shortcut. It was a portal. Here we enter a delicate and profound point. If human beings become conscious, they also become responsible for their creations. Thoughts generate actions. Actions generate consequences. And consequences shape destinies. To be like gods, in this sense, is not about controlling the world, but about taking responsibility for the impact of one's own choices. That is why this promise could not be fully understood before experience. It needed to be lived. Throughout the centuries, this idea has been softened, distorted, or even hidden. Because a humanity that understands its own creative power doesn't depend so much on intermediaries. It questions. It seeks. It transforms. And transformation always shakes established structures. Perhaps that's why the traditional narrative has insisted so much on associating this promise with error, deception, and downfall. It was easier to teach obedience than responsibility. But when we look closely, we realize there is no explicit lie in the serpent's speech. After the fruit, they do indeed come to know. They begin to perceive. They begin to choose. What changes is their internal state. Consciousness expands. And with it, the human experience as we know it is born. An experience made of contrasts, learning, falls, and reconstructions. This is not punishment. It is a journey. This promise is also deeply connected to the idea of creation. To create is not merely to produce something material. To create is to interpret reality, to assign meaning, to construct identity. Every decision made from consciousness shapes how the world is experienced. In this sense, the human being becomes a co-creator of their own existence. Not above the divine, but in partnership with it, starting from the spark they carry. And perhaps that's where the narrative gets even more interesting. Because if that promise was real, then the story of Eden isn't just about a distant past. It's about a continuous process. A process that repeats itself whenever someone breaks free from autopilot and begins to question inherited truths. Whenever someone chooses to think for themselves, feel for themselves, and decide for themselves. That's the true impact of the promise. It doesn't end in the garden. As this understanding deepens, other questions begin to arise. If consciousness was awakened, why was it so feared? If the autonomy of the soul was possible, why was it associated with guilt? These questions open doors to even deeper layers of this story, layers that involve control, narrative, and symbolic power. And when we begin to follow this thread, we realize that Eden may never have been just a place, but a state of being. If this reflection sparked something in you, leave a comment with a word or short phrase that represents what resonated most with you. Something like, "I'm starting to understand," or "This resonated deeply." When we look at the fruit merely as a forbidden object, we completely miss the depth of the symbolism it carries. Within this narrative, the fruit is neither ordinary food nor an arbitrary test of obedience. It represents a breaking point, a silent instant in which something within the human being is activated for the first time. Not sin, but choice. And this difference changes everything. Because choosing is not just acting against an order, it is becoming aware of one's own path. Up to that point, Eve lives in a state of external orientation. Everything is already defined, structured, organized. There is no internal conflict, no real doubt, no need for deep discernment. The garden functions as a space of safety, but also of limitation. A place where experience is protected, yet incomplete. The fruit emerges as a symbol of the possibility of going beyond this state. Not as a trap, but as a threshold. A silent invitation to transformation. When Eva extends her hand, the gesture is not impulsive in a superficial sense. It carries curiosity, perception, and above all, intention. For the first time, the decision does not come from outside. It is born from within. And this is essential to understanding the impact of this moment. Free will is not something comfortable when it arises. It brings with it doubt, responsibility, and the need to deal with consequences. But that is precisely what makes it so powerful. Without choice, there is no real growth, only repetition. The fruit, then, comes to symbolize that moment when the human being ceases to be merely led and begins to actively participate in their own journey. This is a central point that many interpretations avoid exploring because it shifts the narrative from guilt to maturity. Eve is not just someone who disobeys, she is someone who decides. And deciding is a creative act. Every decision opens paths, closes others, and redefines the relationship with the world around us. This reading connects the myth of Eden directly to philosophy. Since the earliest thinkers, the idea of freedom has always been associated with the capacity to choose, even knowing that this involves risks. Choice is what separates instinct from consciousness. It is what transforms existence into experience. By eating the fruit, humanity symbolically crosses this portal. There is no longer only what is permitted or forbidden. What is possible emerges. And the possible is always more complex than the certain. It's important to understand that, from this moment on, light and shadow begin to coexist. Choice doesn't just generate clarity, it generates conflict. And this isn't a flaw in the process, but part of it. Creating one's own path means dealing with uncertainties, failures, and learning. The fruit doesn't offer ready-made answers. It awakens questions. It inaugurates a journey where each step demands awareness, reflection, and personal responsibility. This explains why this symbol transcends so many cultures and eras. It speaks of something universal. In terms of mindset, this moment represents a profound turning point. Human beings cease to operate solely under external rules and begin to develop internal criteria. This changes their relationship with authority, with the divine, and with themselves. Truth ceases to be merely something received and becomes something sought. And every true search transforms the seeker. The impact of this symbol goes far beyond the biblical narrative. It echoes in every conscious decision made throughout life. When we look at our own journeys, we realize how many fruits appear along the way. Moments when we need to choose between the comfort of the known and the risk of the unknown. Between following external expectations or listening to our own conscience. These moments are never neutral. They always carry consequences. But they also carry the possibility of expansion. The myth of Eden then becomes a mirror. It reveals internal workings that we all recognize, even unconsciously. The fruit also symbolizes the loss of automatic innocence. But losing innocence is not losing purity. It is gaining discernment. It is seeing reality with more layers. Understanding that all creation involves responsibility. That every choice shapes experience. This is a hidden truth that transcends myth and reaches everyday life. Nothing we choose is isolated. Each decision connects to others, forming a network of impact that defines who we become. And perhaps that's why this story has been interpreted for so long as a fall. Because assuming one's own capacity to choose is challenging. It's easier to believe that someone else decided for us. It's more comfortable to transfer responsibility. But the symbol of the fruit points to the opposite. It suggests that true awakening begins when we stop being merely guided and start creating, even without guarantees. As this understanding deepens, we realize that Eden was not lost in the literal sense. It was transformed. Security was exchanged for possibility. Blind obedience gave way to active awareness. And this opens up space for even deeper reflections on who benefits when choice is seen as a mistake, and what it truly means to embrace one's own spiritual path. These questions do not end the story, they expand it. If this part of the reflection resonated with you, write a word in the comments that represents it, something like conscious choice or I am awakening. When the narrative speaks of a fall, the image that almost always comes to mind is that of a severe punishment, a penalty imposed from the outside in. But when we look more closely, we realize that this reading is perhaps the most superficial of all. The fall can be understood as an inevitable movement, the descent of consciousness into experience. Not an arbitrary expulsion, but the direct consequence of seeing more than before. Because from the moment consciousness awakens, it is no longer possible to remain untouched, protected, or oblivious to the complexity of existence. The innocence of Eden was not a virtue in the moral sense. It was an absence of contrast. There was no pain because there was no real choice. There was no fear because there was no responsibility. Everything functioned in a state of predictable order. When this order is broken by consciousness, something new and uncomfortable emerges, the full human experience. And this experience includes sensations that did not exist before. Pain, insecurity, doubt, effort. Not as punishments, but as inevitable side effects of awakening. Consciousness expands the field of perception. With it comes the ability to imagine scenarios, anticipate losses, compare states, and desire what one does not have. Fear is born precisely there. Not because something evil has been imposed on humankind, but because the mind can now project possibilities. Suffering arises when we perceive limitations, when we feel the distance between what we are and what we could be. This is the price of lucidity. And every process of profound transformation carries this same pattern. First discomfort, then integration. The so-called fall marks the beginning of a journey where nothing is automatic anymore. Human beings need to learn, make mistakes, adjust, and decide again. This generates fatigue, frustration, but also depth. Wisdom is not born from the absence of pain, but from the ability to traverse it consciously. This point completely changes how we perceive the myth. The fall ceases to be a moral failing and becomes a rite of passage. A plunge into concrete reality, where spirituality is no longer abstract, but lived in the body, in emotions, and in daily choices. It is at this moment that the narrative connects with real life in an almost disconcerting way. We all, at some point, experience our own fall. A moment when our worldview shatters. It could be through a loss, a disappointment, an internal crisis, a difficult decision. Before that, everything seems simpler. Then nothing is the same. But it is precisely there that maturity begins to form. Not because we choose to suffer, but because we choose to see. The hidden truth behind this idea is that there is no awakening without cost. Consciousness demands energy, presence, and responsibility. It takes us out of autopilot. It forces us to confront internal contradictions, personal shadows, emotional limits. And that hurts. But it also expands. The fall, seen from this perspective, is not the end of the relationship with the divine. It is the change in that relationship. The divine ceases to be merely an external authority and becomes something that dialogues with the inner consciousness. This process completely transforms the human mindset. The question ceases to be what is allowed, and becomes, what do I do with what I now know? This change is profound. It shifts the focus from obedience to responsibility, from fear of punishment to understanding the consequences. This doesn't make the journey easier, but it makes it more real. And perhaps that's exactly what the narrative tries to communicate symbolically. Pain and suffering, in this context, are not enemies of spirituality. They are part of its maturation. They are signs that something is being integrated, questioned, transformed. When consciousness expands, it comes into contact with the imperfection of the world and with itself. And this contact generates friction. But it is in friction that discernment is refined. Wisdom is not born in absolute comfort, but in conscious journeying. By reinterpreting the fall in this way, something important happens. Guilt loses its power. In its place, understanding emerges. It's not about justifying everything, but about understanding the process. Human beings didn't fall because they failed. They fell because they awakened. And awakening means leaving a state of protection for a state of experience. It means exchanging the security of innocence for the depth of wisdom. This exchange is never neutral. It demands losses, but it also opens up possibilities that simply didn't exist before. This reading also explains why humanity simultaneously harbors a nostalgia for paradise and a constant drive for evolution. There is a symbolic memory of a simpler state, but also an inner force that pushes forward. To learn, create, transform. The fall is the point of tension between these two forces. And perhaps it is precisely at this point that the spiritual journey becomes truly human. As this understanding deepens, we begin to realize that the story of Eden speaks not only of the past, but of the continuous present. Each conscious choice moves us away from automatic innocence and closer to creative responsibility. And this responsibility brings weight, but also meaning. It is in this space between pain and lucidity that something even deeper begins to reveal itself. If this vision of the fall as awakening resonated with you, Write something simple in the comments like, "This makes sense to me," or "I'm experiencing this awakening." When we say that the knowledge received in Eden liberated the soul, it's necessary to understand that we're not talking about freedom in a comfortable or romantic sense. It's not the freedom to do anything without consequences. It's a deeper and more demanding freedom. The freedom to choose who to become, even without guarantees, even carrying the weight of that choice. Before knowledge, this possibility didn't exist. There was only a fixed, determined state where the human being simply was. After knowledge, something completely different emerges. Identity ceases to be given and begins to be constructed. This is a point that many ancient traditions understood in a much more sophisticated way than is usually imagined. For Gnostic currents, for example, awakening was not seen as sin, but as the breaking of a veil. The world, previously perceived automatically, begins to be questioned. The soul stops accepting everything as it is and begins to seek meaning. This movement generates internal conflict because questioning means losing certainties, and losing certainties hurts. But at the same time, it is this discomfort that drives transformation. Knowledge, in this context, is not merely information. It is consciousness applied to one's own existence. It is the moment when the human being realizes that they are not condemned to repeat an immutable pattern. They can decide. They can change course. They can err and correct. They can reject one path and build another. This capacity for decision is what makes the human soul unique. And it is precisely for this reason that awakening has never been presented, in the deepest traditions, as something simple or light. It is liberating, but also destabilizing. Ancient philosophies already pointed out that ignorance brings a kind of artificial peace. As long as one doesn't see, one doesn't suffer. But one also doesn't grow. Knowledge breaks this peace, but offers something in return, meaning. Life ceases to be merely survival or obedience and becomes a journey. A journey full of invisible backstage events, where each decision shapes not only external destiny, but the internal structure of the soul. At this point, it becomes clear why so many spiritual narratives associate awakening with pain. Not because knowledge is cruel, but because it reveals. It reveals limitations, contradictions, internal inconsistencies. It reveals what was hidden beneath the surface. And every revelation has an impact. Hidden truth almost never arrives without shaking something. It demands repositioning, a change of mindset, a revision of beliefs. This is liberation, but it is not comfortable. Eden, then, ceases to be merely a place lost in the past and becomes a state of consciousness that has been surpassed. A stage prior to choice. By crossing this threshold, the human being gains something that no automatic paradise could offer. The possibility of becoming the author of their own story. Not an omnipotent author, but a responsible author. Someone who writes their own narrative knowing that every line has consequences. Mystical traditions speak of this process as a descent followed by a conscious ascent. First, the soul plunges into the density of human experience. Then it learns to ascend consciously, carrying with it what has been learned. It is not about returning to the starting point, but about integrating the acquired knowledge. Awakening does not erase the pain, but teaches how to transform it into understanding. And that changes everything. True freedom lies not in avoiding suffering, but in giving meaning to it. Knowledge offers precisely that. It doesn't promise constant protection, but it offers clarity. It doesn't guarantee easy answers, but it broadens the questions. And it is these questions that expand consciousness. Every decision made from that point actively shapes the soul. Nothing is completely imposed anymore. Even in the face of limitations, there is a choice of stance, of interpretation, of inner direction. Perhaps this is the greatest hidden revelation in the story of Eden. Knowledge did not distance humanity from the divine, but brought it closer in a more mature way. A relationship based not on blind innocence, but on conscious dialogue. The divine ceases to be merely an external authority and becomes a presence that reveals itself in awakened consciousness, in personal ethics, in the silent decisions of daily life. When this understanding begins to fall into place, something reorganizes itself internally. The narrative of guilt gives way to the narrative of responsibility. The idea of punishment gives way to the notion of learning. The fall reveals itself as the beginning of a long journey, full of challenges, but also full of possibilities. And it is at this point that the story ceases to be merely symbolic and begins to directly touch upon the current human experience. Because deep down, we are all dealing with the same knowledge, the awareness that our choices shape who we become. And the deeper we delve into this, the more we realize that there are still layers of this truth that have not been explored. If this reflection has sparked something in you, write a word like freedom, awakening, or transformation in the comments, because this journey still has important developments ahead. When we look at all of this from the present, it becomes impossible to deny that the echo of that ancient promise still vibrates within the human experience. The phrase spoken in Eden did not remain confined to a distant myth. It has traversed centuries, cultures, and belief systems and continues to manifest itself subtly in the decisions we make every day. Whenever someone questions an imposed path, whenever the restlessness of wanting to understand more arises, whenever the mind refuses to accept ready-made answers, this echo reappears. It does not come as an external voice, but as an internal feeling that there is something beyond the obvious. Today, the promise doesn't appear in the form of a serpent, but as doubt, as curiosity, as existential unease. It appears when someone feels they are merely surviving and not living, when they realize that following rules without awareness creates emptiness, when they understand that repeating inherited patterns, without reflection, exacts a silent price. This is the modern impact of the same old invitation, to become conscious. And curiously, the fear that arises from this is also the same. Fear of making mistakes, fear of losing security, fear of discovering truths that demand change. We live in an age of information overload, but not necessarily of awareness. Knowing many things doesn't mean having inner clarity. The knowledge that liberates is not what is accumulated, but what transforms. And this distinction is essential. Many shy away from this type of knowledge because it demands responsibility. Once you see, you can no longer pretend you didn't see. Once you understand, you can no longer hide behind ignorance. This is the point where the promise becomes uncomfortable. Being conscious is not just about awakening, it's about sustaining that awakening in daily life. And here an inevitable question arises. Are we truly living as conscious beings, or merely repeating behaviors out of fear of assuming our own autonomy? The promise of being like gods never spoke of power over the external world, but of inner sovereignty, of governing one's own mind, one's own decisions, one's own journey. However, this requires abandoning the position of automatic victim of circumstances and assuming an active role, even when the scenario is adverse. Behind the scenes of modern life, this choice happens all the time. When someone remains in a situation that no longer makes sense simply out of fear of change. When they avoid questioning inherited beliefs so as not to face internal conflicts. When they prefer a comfortable lie to a transformative truth. In all these moments, the echo of the promise is present, offering a silent fork in the road. To remain unconscious or to traverse the discomfort of awakening. The curious thing is that society often romanticizes freedom, but rejects the process necessary to achieve it. There's a lot of talk about authenticity, but little about responsibility. There's talk of purpose, but the confrontation with one's own shadows is avoided. The myth of Eden already warned of this. Consciousness brings light, but also reveals shadows. Ignoring this aspect is to live an incomplete, superficial spirituality that seeks only emotional comfort, not real transformation. Perhaps the great dilemma of our time is not the lack of knowledge, but the fear of what that knowledge demands. Because awakening means reviewing choices, adjusting paths, abandoning old versions of oneself. It means admitting that some pains did not come from outside, but from decisions not made. And this affects identity. The hidden truth almost always threatens the narrative we tell ourselves. Even so, the call remains. It doesn't force, it doesn't impose, it simply repeats itself. In personal crises, in silent questioning, in moments of rupture. The promise continues to echo, not as temptation, but as a possibility. The possibility of living with more awareness, even knowing that this doesn't eliminate suffering, only gives it new meaning. The conscious journey doesn't promise ease, but it offers meaning. And meaning changes everything. That's why this myth remains so relevant today. It speaks not only of the beginning of humanity, but of the beginning of each individual awakening. Each person relives, in their own way, the moment of choice. To remain in the safety of unconsciousness, or to cross the threshold of consciousness, with all its implications. And this choice doesn't happen just once. It is constantly renewed in small daily decisions. Perhaps the most honest reflection we can make now is not about the past, but about the present. About how we are dealing with this echo. Whether we are using knowledge as a tool for transformation or merely as discourse. Whether we are willing to pay the price of lucidity, or whether we still prefer the protection of willful blindness. These questions do not demand immediate answers, but they open up an inner space that continues to expand. And it is precisely at this point that it is worth slowing down and observing more carefully what this myth still wants to reveal when we look at it without fear, because there are deeper layers to this promise that directly touch on how we see the world, ourselves, and the role of consciousness in the human experience. If this reflection resonated with you, comment something like "This made me think," or "I'm questioning my choices," because this dialogue continues to unfold from here. If you've made it this far, it's because something in this conversation resonated deeply with you. And that's precisely why it's worth continuing this journey with me. This channel exists to delve deeper into reflections like this, to bring to light layers that are usually hidden, and to connect old ideas with the choices we make today. If this type of content helps you think better, see more clearly, and mature your own consciousness, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next dives we'll be taking together. If you feel like it, leave a comment saying something like, "This message was for me," or "I kept thinking about this until the end," just so I know you were here with me until the end of this journey. And if at any point you felt a connection, if something truly resonated with you, leave a like on the video. That shows that this kind of conversation deserves to continue existing and reaching more people. And before you leave, take a look at the video that's appearing over here. It directly complements everything we've explored today and further deepens this reflection. Click there and continue with me.